Alright, engine repair 2 test 5. What does the W in SAE 5W20 mean?
Wait.
Everybody put that? Everybody got it wrong. It means winter. You know
I would
that?
have never guessed that.
Winter. That's what it stands for. Google it if you don't believe me. Winter is what it stands for. What they're wanting is the oil to act like a 5 viscosity oil whenever it's cold and a 20 viscosity oil when it's hot. See, it's a multi-viscosity oil. Oil change intervals as specified by the vehicle manufacturer. Which answer is that? Are they minimum time and mileage intervals? Maximum time? They misspelled mileage too. I just love the person that typed this test. Or maximum time and mileage intervals generally only include time between oil changes or only include miles driven between oil changes. That's maximum time and mileage intervals. Now you know some of your maintenance schedules will have 3,000 mile and 5,000 mile, you know, and then 7,500 I've seen some of them. But basically it depends on how you're using the vehicle. A lot of city driving, you're going to need oil changes more regularly and all that. Which rating is the ACEA rating specified for use by many European vehicle manufacturers? That would be A3, B3. That would be C on that one. And number 4, Technician A says engine oil should be used to meet the vehicle manufacturer standards. Technician B says the specified viscosity of oil should be used. Who's right about that? That's both technicians, and I'll tell you what's going on with that. The newer vehicles get, and the more stuff they have that's driven by oil, like the tensioners and, you know, the valve lifters, and some of the, you know, the GM vehicles now are actually dropping out some cylinders going down the road. And a lot of this stuff, particularly on hybrid vehicles too, it's best to use the oil that they say to use, the viscosity. And if it says to use full synthetic oil, like the Chrysler Crossfire and another vehicle we were changing oil in, if it says to use full synthetic oil, use full synthetic oil. You know, don't substitute anything like that. And here's something else. If you've got an oil filter that, you know, like sometimes I've seen oil change places will get in trouble because they'll just say, they just find an oil filter that will fit and screw it on there. Well, there are some engines out there that the relief valve for the oil system is built into the filter. And if you put the wrong filter on there, it'll burn the engine up. That has happened, you know, so be careful with that. Make sure you're using the right filter, and make sure, and also I've actually seen some too, they had bad threads. Oil filters that had bad threads that wouldn't screw on there right. And some of them, if you know, you'll get one that's, so, but occasionally you'll see one where the oil filter they send you is bigger or longer or something like that, and you always double check that. Sometimes it's a minor thing, and they say either one will work, but just make sure you double check it and go on and make a notation on your work order if you're, you know, doing something like that. Technician A says some vehicle manufacturers recommend LSAC grade should be used in the engine, and LSAC grade that should be used in the engine. And Technician B says an oil with the specified API rating and SAE viscosity rating should be used in an engine. That's 5. That's both of those guys are right. You know, be careful. Make sure you use the right stuff. 2 technicians are discussing oil filters. Technician A says the oil will remain perfectly clean if just the oil filters change regularly. Would you think that would be true? No. Technician B says oil filters can filter particles smaller than the human eye can see. Who's correct about that? B. That's B is right on that one. And over, you see that little paper I got over there on that bolt bin that's got all those oil filters cut apart? That's a pretty interesting paper because it shows you all the different brands of oil filters, and it's got them, you know, cut apart so you can see how they're made and all. And they got that little spring-loaded plate down the bottom of the filter, and what that plate does is it enables the engine to get lubrication. Even if the oil filter is stopped completely up, it'll move that little plate and let oil go around the filter, because dirty oil is better than no oil, right? So you don't want an oil that's going to completely clog up and keep, you know, the oil from getting to the engine. Number 7, the purpose of the oil filter. Are you marking the ones wrong that people got wrong? You are, aren't you? Curtis, are you doing that? Yeah. Okay. How y'all doing so far? Okay, that's what I thought. Okay, the let's see, I'll tell you the purpose of oil filter bypass valve, which is what I was just talking about, is to do what? Allow oil to bypass the filter becomes clogged. That's what you'll see those on that little paper over there I got on that door. Different brands of oil can be used in a vehicle from one oil change to the other if they meet vehicle specs, because oil is what?
D.
Huh?
D.
Wait, is that Baker or Delta?
D.
Oh, no, it's actually, believe it or not, B. Miscible. Think of that as mixable. Older engines that use flat bottom lifters should use oil or an additive that has enough what?
C.
Zinc. It needs zinc. You don't read the book, you won't know the answers, right? Normal oil pump pressure in an engine is how many PSI?
C.
10 to 60. What it's going to be, it's going to be about 10 PSI per 1,000 RPM. Got it? That's the minimum. If you got the engine running at about 4,000 RPM, you should be showing at least 40 pounds of pressure. Usually when you got an oil pressure problem, it'll show up at idle when the oil pump is not turning as fast. What can cause your oil pressure to be low? Anybody know? Think about it. That ain't really hard if you think about it. Come up with something.
Low oil.
Huh?
Low oil.
That's a good answer, low oil. What about worn out bearings? Because you got these journals are spinning in bearings where they're supposed to be really nice and snug, you know. Not, they ought to spin freely with oil in between them. But if they're worn out to the point to where the oil pressure can squirt out of there instead of actually, you know, because it's pumped under pressure to those journals. And what we would do, and I always like to talk about this Jeep Cherokee that we had that they bought, and somebody bought it with 30,000 miles on it, and paid $10,000 for it, and it was several years ago. And they drove it. First time the oil was changed, the pressure went away. Somebody had put a bunch of goop in it to make it have oil pressure, and they bought it at used car lot. Used car lot wouldn't do nothing for them. So what we did was we pulled the tire store where it was being looked at called me, and they said it needed an oil pump, so they popped an oil pump on it, and it helped with the pressure. Pressure was helped, but it wasn't fixed because you had good pressure hot whenever the oil got thin. When it got hot, you know, good pressure cold. When the oil got thin, when it warmed up, the pressure would drop away. And so we pulled the oil pan off when they got it over here, pulled the oil pump off, and we shot air up into the oil gallery, and we looked to see where it came from, and it was hissing from around the cam bearings really bad. So we pulled the cam bearings out and, you know, put new cam bearings in it and fix that one. But that's another thing, worn out bearings. What about, why do you have oil pressure anyway? You got a positive displacement oil pump, right? If it turns, oil's going to go somewhere. Right? If there's oil there, it's going to go somewhere. This lady called me the other day, and she didn't call me, she sent me an email. She said her husband had rebuilt their Power Stroke diesel, and it wouldn't start. And it didn't have any low, you know, any oil pressure when he was trying to start it. And I said, well, what he's going to need to do is take the oil pump and take it apart and pack the oil pump with grease. And that will enable it to develop a suction that's going to pull oil up in there. And then that will fill up the high pressure pump reservoir. And then the high pressure oil will get out of the injectors, and then you'll start getting, you know, start firing up. And so she said that he packed the oil pump with grease, just like I said, and it got oil pressure and it fired up, but it blew the oil filter off the truck. And she said, what in the Sam Hill do we do now? And I says, you have a stuck oil pressure relief valve. That's the only thing that can cause that. Because the relief valve is a little plunger and a bore riding on a spring, and when that pressure comes up in that bore, it actually is going to push that plunger until it opens up a little port to relieve that pressure. That's how the relief valve works. If the relief valve spring is broke and it's stuck up in there too far, you won't have any oil pressure, even if you got a good oil pump, and the relief valve is somewhere else and you didn't check it, and it's stuck so that port's open all the time, you won't have any oil pressure and you'll burn the motor up. If you got too much pressure, it's because the relief valve is hung up so that the oil can't even push it up, squeeze the spring, and open that port. See, that's what oil pressure relief valve is all about. You see that oil pump up there, that stem sticking off of it?
Yes.
That actually, that pencil-shaped shaft comes from the bottom of the distributor. The distributor spins that oil pump. You can put the pickup tube for that oil pump in a pan of oil, and you can spin that pencil-shaped shaft, and if you spin it the direction the oil pump works, it'll shoot oil from here to that wall over there. It just make a mess. You know, I was out here one day and I was going to demonstrate to the students. You know, he says, well, I'm going to make this oil pump work. And so they're all standing around. I stuck it in there and I shot it and it goes, pew, just went all over the place. I mean, that thing will sure enough move some dadgum oil. I mean, real fast too. It's designed for that. But positive displacement, even though it's positive displacement, you will have no oil pressure if the relief valve is stuck open, if the spring is broke, or whatever. So the relief valve is an important deal. But it acts like a relief valve when your bearings are wore out too, so that's why bearing is pretty important to be, you plastic gauge them when you're building the engine and all that stuff. All right, let me see. Two technicians are discussing oil pumps. Technician A says many oil pumps are driven directly off the front of the crankshaft. Technician B says some are driven from the distributor if the engine uses a distributor type ignition. Who's correct about that? Both of them are. Some engines don't have a distributor, but they've got what looks like the bottom of a distributor sitting down in that bore, and it's driven by the camshaft, and that drives the oil pump. Some of them, the crankshaft drives the oil pump. On a Toyota Camry like that we got on stand out there, the oil pump is driven by the timing belt. Can you see where that would be a problem? Why?
Oh, I didn't expect you to ask me.
Yeah. I mean, the oil pump's driven by the timing belt. Is that a problem?
If they're not timed right.
Well, the timing belt, the oil pump doesn't have to be timed. It's just that the timing belt goes around it. Is there ever a set of circumstances where the timing belt would quit spinning the oil pump and the engine would keep running? Heck no. If the timing belt's out, the engine's not going to run anyway. You know what I mean? But the relief valve is not in the pump. Actually, it's the pump is the whole bottom part of that plate, and it's over there in another part of it. And there's one right up there, by the way, if you ever want to look at it, up in that. I got several oil pumps up in that thing right there. But some oil pumps are driven at half crankshaft speed. Those are the ones that are driven by the camshaft or the distributor, and the other ones are driven at full speed. Here's another thing. Some of the Cadillacs years ago had a oil pump on the nose of the crankshaft, like a lot of engines have nowadays, and they would park and they'd go into the store and they'd come back out and they'd crank the car up and it'd be rattling up a storm because they'd have no oil pressure because the oil pump lost its prime, right? How in the world do you do about that? Well, at the Cadillac place, what they were told by the manufacturer to do was put 20 quarts of oil in the crankcase. So much oil that it couldn't help but get a prime. Then you crank it up, and when it got its prime, you drain it back out till you got the 5 quarts or 5.5 or whatever's supposed to go in there, and then you got your prime back. But that's kind of crazy. Other ones that have, like some of the Buicks that we would see, that the distributor was running down through the front of the timing cover so that you could see the oil pump. You could actually take a plate off and see the gears for the oil pump. If somebody took the oil filter off of one of those and left it off for a while so that that pump went completely empty, you might crank that darn thing up and it might not have any oil pressure. Just fire up and rattle up a storm. And you had to take that plate off and pack grease around them gears to get it to suck oil up in there, you know. So just remember all that sort of thing. If I don't tell you that stuff, I'll forget it. Let's see. In typical, wait a minute, a typical oil pump can pump how many gallons per minute?
6 to 10.
What do you think? What about?
I don't think it's right, but that's what.
3 to 6, actually. I think that's probably pretty accurate. If it could fill up a 5-gallon bucket in 60 seconds, you know what I mean? That's a fast-moving pump. In typical engine lubrication systems, what components are the last to receive oil and the first to suffer from a lack of oil pressure?
See?
The valve train. You're going to hear clickety-click on the lifters if you're low on oil, right? That's why in the Jeep I was talking about a while ago, the cam bearings wore out before anything else did. The crankshaft, the crank bearings and all the rod bearings look good.
The valve train would be the first to get oil, though.
It's the first to suffer and it's the last to get oil. The oil is actually going to be pumped into the crankshaft. What needs it the worst, Brian? The crankshaft is the hardest working part, right? I mean, it needs lubrication in a big way. There are some parts of the engine that just have oil splashed on them, like the timing chain. There are some parts that have it pumped in there pressurized. And so, you know, there's a lot of splashing going on down in there. Let's see, hydrodynamic lubrication created by the wedging action of oil between the crankshaft journal and bearing can be as high as how many psi? 1,000. How they measured that, I don't know. Can be up to 1,000 psi though. I'm not saying you're ever going to need to know that information, but it's interesting. What type of oil pump is driven by the crankshaft?
Internal, external gear.
What do you think? It's a D, right? Both A and B. This is one right here. This one here broke. But this is an oil pump. This is a Gerotor style oil pump. That's what that is. And this was one that somebody broke when they were putting one of the trainer engines back together. And sometimes that happens. They get broke. So anyway, that's what that looks like. And this is, sometimes you'll take the engine apart and you'll find one that's, you know, broke or it's worn out like that. And that'll be, and of course if it does that, it'll foul up. This lady drove this 99 F-150 that had a 5.4 in it one time. She was driving it and she drove it home from where she worked. And when she went out there the next morning to get in it, it was locked up. So we got it in here and pulled the motor out and tore it down, and you know, just to see. But it had welded itself together in there. You know, it just driving without oil pressure. It must have been about to seize up about the time she parked it. You know, it had really good timing. But we put a crate engine in that one. And we got from Ford. It was like $2,500. Got it going. Let me see here. Lower than specified oil pressure is measured on a high mileage engine. Technician A says worn main or rod bearing should be the cause. Technician B says a clogged oil pump pickup screen could be the cause. Which technician is correct? That's number 16.
C.
C is correct. There's a guy came in here one day. There were some carpenters working out here that was working on one of these buildings one time. And he came in here and he goes, my little Ford Ranger has lost oil pressure. And all of a sudden, and I don't know, you know, he said oil pressure's been dropping off for a while, but now it doesn't have any, and I'm afraid I'm going to destroy it. And I said, well, the pickup screen is probably clogged up with crud, because that's usually on an old high mileage vehicle like that that's driven the way that you know, carpenters move short distances and all. I said, that screen's going to need to be cleaned. You know what that knothead did? He jacked that thing up right out there on the parking lot, and he got under it, and he took the oil drain plug out, and he drained all the oil out of it. And he got him a little old pen light, and he shined it up in there at that screen, and he could see that screen through the oil drain plug hole. And he got some spray, and he sprayed that darn thing, and he washed it out real good, going through the oil drain plug hole, and he cleaned it up, and he put oil in it, and he got oil pressure, and he drove that thing on. He was a can-do kind of a guy, you know. And I'm saying, well, you know, and this is the other thing. That's not the conventional way of doing stuff, but I'm kind of pragmatic. You know, I mean, he didn't get the sludge out of his pan. It's probably going to pick up some more later. But if you're in a bind, you do what works. I knew a guy one time that was out in the middle of the country, and he was a pretty knowledgeable old guy that could, you know, mechanic on his own car, and he understood how things worked. A pretty smart guy. And he found himself, I don't know what happened, something happened, and he lost all his brake fluid. I can't, for the life of me, remember what happened that caused him to lose all his brake fluid. But he put water in there. Had to get home, didn't want to drive without brakes, didn't have no brake fluid, didn't have no way to buy none, didn't have nobody to bring him one, there weren't no cell phones. So he went and found some water in a ditch, and he poured it in his master cylinder and bled it like he was bleeding brakes. And he drove it home. And then he got all that water out of there, put brake fluid in it. Whatever worked.
Water will make brakes work.
Well, it's hydraulic. Now, it's easy for it to boil if the brakes start to get hot. You know, the boiling point's going to be too low for it to be good for very long. But if you go easy, you know. But I mean, he could manage to do that. In Siberia, they use vodka for brake fluid. And the reason they do that is because the regular brake fluid freezes at 60 below zero. So they got to use something that won't freeze, and vodka won't freeze, you know. Or the freezing point's so low. Anyway, but like I say, pragmatism is my watchword. It's like my dad, you know, years ago when he was working on my mom's air conditioner, he'd get engine vacuum and hook it up to a hose and hook it into the AC system when he needed to pull the air out of it before he charged it up. He just let the engine idle and let the engine vacuum pull the air out of the AC system, And then he'd take that hose loose and he'd put some refrigerant in it, and it's just cold as anyway, that kind of, he didn't get, I'm sure he didn't get all the oil out, I mean air out, but he got enough out where it didn't matter, and that was back when everybody used R12. Let's see, let's see, wait a minute, excuse me. Engine oil passages in an engine block are called what? Somebody give me an answer.
B.
How about galleries? Those are called galleries. A dry sump system is used in some high-performance vehicles because why?
D.
It allows the engine to develop more power. It allows the vehicle to corner or brake for long periods of time. It allows for greater oil capacity so that oil temperatures can be controlled. And that is all of the above. Top fuel dragsters are made like that. An engine oil cooler usually uses what to cool the oil?
Air. Air.
Well, not usually. I mean, it can, but it typically is coolant because it'll actually flow through some tubes that have coolant flowing around them. You know, like the oil. You remember the oil cooler in that radiator on that didn't you change a radiator had an engine oil cooler in it? Or was I thinking about somebody else? Technician A says the oil pressure is normally higher when the engine's cold. Technician B says normal engine oil pump pressure ranges from 20 to 80 psi, or 20 psi for every 1,000 engine RPM. Which technician is correct? That's actually A. Who learned something? How many people know stuff they didn't know before?